Sarah Mitchell had always dreamed of making a difference in the world. Growing up in a small town in Ohio, she watched the news with her father every evening, seeing stories of conflict and humanitarian crises that seemed so far away from her quiet suburban life. When she graduated from college with a degree in international relations and a minor in Arabic, she knew exactly what she wanted to do with her life. The opportunity came through the International Relief Foundation, a non-governmental organization that provided aid to war-torn regions across the Middle East. Sarah's language skills and her genuine desire to help people made her an ideal candidate for their field operations. After months of training and preparation, she found herself assigned to a team working in a disputed region along the Syrian-Iraqi border, where thousands of displaced families desperately needed medical supplies, food, and basic shelter. The team consisted of 5 aid workers from different countries, each bringing their own expertise to the mission. There was Dr. James Harrison, a British physician who had worked in conflict zones for over a decade. Maria Santos, a logistics coordinator from Spain who could organize supply chains in the most challenging conditions. Ahmed al-Rashid, a local translator whose knowledge of the tribal dynamics in the region proved invaluable. And Tom Bradley, an American security consultant whose job was to keep the team safe while they carried out their humanitarian work. Sarah's role involved coordinating with local community leaders and assessing the needs of displaced families. She spent her days visiting makeshift refugee camps, documenting what supplies were most urgently needed, and helping to distribute aid packages to families who had lost everything. The work was exhausting and emotionally draining, but every smile from a child receiving a meal or every grateful handshake from an elderly man getting medical attention reminded her why she had chosen this path. The region they worked in was technically under the control of coalition forces, but the reality on the ground was much more complicated. Various militia groups operated in the area, and the lines between friend and foe were often blurred. The team followed strict security protocols, always traveling with armed escorts and maintaining regular communication with their headquarters in Baghdad. They had established a temporary base of operations in a compound that had once served as a school, its classrooms now converted into storage areas for supplies and sleeping quarters for the team. For 3 months, their work proceeded without major incidents. They had successfully distributed aid to over 2,000 families, and had established a network of local contacts who helped them identify the most vulnerable populations. Sarah had grown close to many of the families she worked with, particularly a widow named Fatima, who had fled her village with her 4 young children. Despite the language barrier, they communicated through gestures, smiles, and the few Arabic phrases Sarah had mastered beyond her formal training. The first signs of trouble came on a Tuesday morning in late September. Ahmed had returned from a meeting with village elders with troubling news. There were rumors that a militant group known as the Black Banner Brigade was moving into the area. Unlike other groups they had encountered, this organization was known for its extreme hostility toward Western aid workers, viewing them as spies and legitimate targets for kidnapping or worse. Tom immediately called for a security review with their military liaison, Captain Rodriguez, who was stationed at a forward operating base about 30 kilometers away. The captain's assessment was sobering but not immediately alarming. Intelligence suggested that the Black Banner Brigade was still several days away from their operational area, and there were coalition patrols that could provide additional security if needed. Despite the potential threat, the team decided to continue their work. They had commitments to several communities, and pulling out suddenly would leave hundreds of families without the aid they desperately needed. However, they agreed to implement additional security measures. All movements would be coordinated with military units. They would maintain constant radio contact with headquarters, and they would be prepared to evacuate at a moment's notice if the situation deteriorated. Sarah threw herself into her work with renewed intensity, knowing that their time in the region might be limited. She spent long days documenting family situations and coordinating with Maria to ensure that the most critical supplies reached those who needed them most. In the evening, she would sit in the courtyard of their compound, writing reports and occasionally calling home to reassure her parents that she was safe and doing meaningful work. The compound itself was a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. What had once been a place of learning had been transformed by war into a refugee shelter. and now served as a beacon of hope for people who had lost almost everything. The walls still bore colorful murals painted by children years earlier, their bright images of flowers and animals providing a stark contrast to the harsh reality of the current situation. On Thursday evening, Dr. Harrison treated a young boy who had been injured by unexploded ordnance while playing near his family's tent. As Sarah watched the doctor work with calm professionalism, cleaning and bandaging the child's wounds while speaking softly in broken Arabic, she felt a deep sense of pride in what their small team was accomplishing. They were not just delivering supplies. They were providing hope and dignity to people who had been stripped of both. That night, Sarah called her parents for what would be their last conversation for many weeks. She told them about the boy Dr. Harrison had treated, about Fatima's youngest daughter who had started calling her Aunt Sarah, and about the small victories that made all the challenges worthwhile. Her mother worried, as mothers do, but Sarah assured her that they were being careful and that their situation was stable. She went to sleep that night with the satisfaction of knowing that tomorrow would bring another opportunity to make a difference in people's lives. She had no way of knowing that by the next evening, her world would be turned upside down, and the skills and courage she had developed over months of humanitarian work would be put to a test she never could have imagined. The attack came at dawn, just as the morning call to prayer echoed across the valley. Sarah woke to the sound of gunfire, not the distant pops they had grown accustomed to, but the sharp crack of weapons being fired close by. Tom was already on the radio, his voice tense but controlled as he attempted to reach their military contacts. The response crackled through the static. The Black Banner Brigade had moved faster than anyone had anticipated, and coalition forces were engaging them at multiple points along the main highway. Within minutes, it became clear that their compound was no longer safe. Through the windows, they could see armed men moving between the buildings of the nearby village, their black flags clearly visible against the pale morning sky. Dr. Harrison quickly began gathering essential medical supplies while Maria worked to destroy sensitive documents that could compromise their local contacts if they fell into the wrong hands. Ahmed's face was pale with fear, not for himself but for his family, who lived in a village 20 kilometers away. He had worked with Western organizations for 3 years, and everyone knew that collaborators faced brutal consequences if captured by groups like the Black Banner Brigade. Sarah watched him make the agonizing decision to flee rather than risk not only his own life but the lives of his wife and children. The evacuation plan they had, rehearsed so many times, suddenly became terrifyingly real. Tom had identified 3 possible routes out of the area, but radio communication with Captain Rodriguez revealed that 2 of them were already compromised. The remaining route would take them north through difficult terrain toward a rendezvous point where military helicopters could extract them. As they prepared to leave, Sarah made a decision that would haunt her teammates for months to come. Fatima and her 4 children had taken shelter in one of the compound's outbuildings during the night, too frightened to return to their tent in the refugee camp as fighting erupted around them. The youngest child, a 5-year-old girl named Layla, was running a high fever and needed immediate medical attention. Sarah knew that taking civilians with them would slow their evacuation and potentially compromise their safety, but she could not bring herself to abandon the family that had come to trust her. She convinced Dr. Harrison that they could not leave Fatima's daughter without medical care, especially since the nearest hospital was now in enemy-controlled territory. The team piled into their 2 armored vehicles, designed to protect against small arms fire and improvised explosive devices. Tom took the lead vehicle with Ahmed and half their supplies, while Sarah, Dr. Harrison, and Maria followed in the second vehicle with Fatima's family crowded into the back seat. The plan was to stay in constant radio contact and move as quickly as possible toward the extraction point. For the first hour, everything went according to plan. They navigated through back roads that Ahmed had identified during their months in the region, avoiding the main highways where coalition forces were engaged in heavy fighting with the militants. The landscape was beautiful in the early morning light, with rolling hills and ancient olive groves that seemed untouched by the violence that had consumed so much of the region. But their luck ran out when they reached a checkpoint that had not existed the day before. Black Banner Brigade fighters had established a roadblock on the only bridge across a deep ravine, effectively cutting off their planned escape route. Tom's voice crackled over the radio, tense but still controlled. They would have to take a longer route that would add several hours to their journey and take them through areas where coalition air support might not be available. The detour led them through a maze of mountain roads that tested both their vehicles and their nerves. Sarah found herself holding Layla, the sick child, as they bounced over rough terrain, trying to keep her comfortable while Dr. Harrison administered medication from their emergency medical kit. Fatima spoke no English, but her grateful looks and gentle touches on Sarah's arm communicated more than words ever could. It was during this detour that disaster struck. As they rounded a sharp curve on a narrow mountain road, they encountered another militant checkpoint. Unlike the first one, which they had been able to avoid, this one was positioned in a place where turning around was impossible. The militants had clearly been waiting for them, suggesting that their movement had been tracked or that someone had provided information about their escape route. Tom made a split-second decision to ram through the checkpoint, hoping that their armored vehicles could withstand the initial gunfire long enough to reach safety on the other side. His gamble almost worked. The lead vehicle smashed through the makeshift barrier and made it around the next bend. But Sarah's vehicle was not so fortunate. A rocket-propelled grenade struck the rear of their vehicle, disabling the engine and causing it to roll off the road into a shallow ditch. Though the armored plating prevented the explosion from being fatal, the crash left Dr. Harrison unconscious with a severe head injury, and Maria trapped beneath a twisted piece of metal that had penetrated the passenger compartment. Sarah found herself relatively uninjured but disoriented, with the sounds of gunfire growing closer as militants approached their disabled vehicle. Fatima was conscious but clearly in shock while her children huddled together in terror. Little Layla, despite her fever, seemed to understand the gravity of their situation better than anyone, her wide eyes reflecting a maturity that no 5-year-old should possess. Through the shattered windshield, Sarah could see Tom's vehicle disappearing around a distant curve, smoke rising from what appeared to be damage from small arms fire. She later learned that he had made the impossible choice that all security personnel train for, but hope never to face. When faced with losing everyone or saving some, he had continued toward the extraction point with Ahmed, carrying vital intelligence about Black Banner Brigade positions that could save hundreds of other lives. As armed figures approached their wreckage, Sarah made her own impossible choice. With Dr. Harrison unconscious and Maria severely injured, she was the only one capable of protecting Fatima's family. Using basic Arabic phrases and gestures, she convinced the militants that she was a medical volunteer who had been trying to help wounded civilians, not a Western intelligence operative. The ruse worked, at least initially. The militants separated her from the obviously injured Dr. Harrison and Maria, who were loaded onto trucks and taken in a different direction. Sarah never saw them again, and their fate remained unknown for many months. She was left with Fatima and the children, presumably because the militants viewed them as potentially valuable hostages rather than immediate threats. As night fell, Sarah found herself in a situation she had never trained for and never imagined possible. She was alone in enemy territory, responsible for the lives of a woman and 4 children who depended on her completely, with no way to communicate with the outside world and no clear plan for survival. The compound that had been her home for 3 months was now a distant memory, and the extraction point where helicopters waited seemed as unreachable as the moon. The militants brought Sarah and Fatima's family to a fortified compound in the mountains, a place that had clearly been used as a stronghold for many months. The buildings were a mixture of ancient stone construction and modern military adaptations, with sandbags, razor wire, and mounted weapons creating a fortress-like appearance. Sarah counted at least 30 fighters, though she suspected there were many more in the network of caves and bunkers that honeycombed the mountainside. Their living conditions were harsh, but not immediately life-threatening. Sarah and the family were given a small room in what had once been a storage building, with concrete walls and a single barred window that looked out onto a courtyard where militants conducted their daily activities. They received basic food twice a day, usually rice or bread with some vegetables, and access to a primitive bathroom facility that served several prisoner holding areas. What troubled Sarah most was the way the militants treated Fatima's children, particularly the boys aged 8 and 12. Several fighters had begun speaking to them in Arabic about joining their cause when they were old enough, filling their minds with stories of heroic battles and religious duty. Sarah watched helplessly as fear began to transform into something else in the older boy's eyes. a dangerous fascination with the weapons and power he saw displayed around him daily. Little Layla's fever had broken after 2 days, thanks partly to medicine that Dr. Harrison had given Sarah before their capture. But the child remained listless and withdrawn. She rarely spoke even to her mother, and spent long hours staring through the barred window or drawing pictures in the dust with her finger. Sarah recognized the signs of severe trauma and worried about the long-term psychological damage being inflicted on all the children. The leader of this particular cell was a man who called himself Abu Rashad, though Sarah suspected this was not his real name. He spoke excellent English and seemed educated, possibly having studied in Europe or America before joining the militant organization. During their second week in captivity, he began having regular conversations with Sarah, probing her background and trying to understand why she had chosen to work in the region. These conversations were both an opportunity and a danger. Sarah realized that Abu Rashad was intelligent enough to see through obvious lies, so she stuck as closely to the truth as possible, while emphasizing her humanitarian motivations. She spoke about her desire to help displaced families, her respect for local cultures and traditions, and her belief that people of all backgrounds deserved basic dignity and care. What she did not tell him was that during her months in the region, she had developed an extensive mental map of militant supply routes, weapons caches, and communication patterns. Her job coordinating with local communities had given her insights into the network of relationships that sustained groups like the Black Banner Brigade, information that would be invaluable to coalition intelligence operations. Abu Rashad seemed particularly interested in Sarah's family background and her motivations for leaving a comfortable life in America. During one conversation, he revealed that he had once been a university professor in Baghdad, specializing in Islamic history and philosophy. The American invasion had destroyed his career and killed 2 of his brothers, transforming him from an academic into a militant leader. Driven by a desire for revenge against Western influence in the region, Sarah found herself in the strange position of feeling genuine sympathy for this man while simultaneously recognizing that he represented a deadly threat to everything she believed in. His intelligence and education made him more dangerous than the typical militant, but also potentially more reasonable if she could find the right approach to appeal to his former academic sensibilities. The breakthrough came during their 3rd week of captivity. Layla had developed a serious respiratory infection that was not responding to the basic antibiotics available in the compound. The child was struggling to breathe, and Fatima was beside herself with worry, begging anyone who would listen to help her daughter. Sarah realized that this was her opportunity to demonstrate her value as something more than just a hostage. Using her basic medical training from her humanitarian work preparation, Sarah correctly diagnosed that Layla needed a specific type of antibiotic and possibly hospitalization if her condition continued to deteriorate. She approached Abu Rashad with a proposal. If he could obtain the necessary medicine from a pharmacy in a nearby town, she would share information about coalition medical facilities that could be useful for treating wounded militants. The gamble worked. Abu Rashad recognized that allowing a child to die unnecessarily would not serve his organization's interests, particularly since Fatima came from a prominent local family whose support the Black Banner Brigade needed to maintain their operations in the region. Within 2 days, the medicine arrived and Layla began to recover. More importantly for Sarah's long-term survival, the incident established her value to her captors as someone with specialized knowledge and skills. Abu Rashad began including her in discussions about logistics and supply issues, testing her knowledge and gradually coming to respect her expertise. She walked a careful line between being helpful enough to remain alive and not providing information that could be used to harm coalition forces or other aid workers. During this period, Sarah also began to understand the complex dynamics within the Black Banner Brigade itself. She observed tensions between different factions, disagreements about strategy and tactics, and personality conflicts between leaders that created opportunities for exploitation. Most importantly, she began to identify which militants might be approachable for negotiation, and which ones viewed her presence as a dangerous security risk. The compound operated on a strict schedule, with prayer times, guard rotations, and supply convoys following predictable patterns. Sarah memorized these rhythms while pretending to be focused solely on caring for Fatima's family. She noted which guards were more relaxed, which areas of the compound were less heavily monitored, and how communication with the outside world was conducted. One evening, while helping Fatima comfort Layla during a particularly difficult night, Sarah overheard a radio conversation that made her blood run cold. Abu Rashad was speaking with someone about plans to move their high-value hostages to a different location, somewhere deeper in the mountains and far from any possible rescue attempt. The conversation suggested that her usefulness as a bargaining chip was being weighed against the security risk of keeping a Western hostage in their primary operational base. Sarah realized that her time for passive observation was running out. If she was going to survive and protect Fatima's family, she would need to take much greater risks than simply providing medical advice and logistics expertise. The skills she had developed during months of humanitarian work in challenging conditions would have to be supplemented by courage and resourcefulness she had never needed before. That night, as she lay on the thin mattress they had been provided, listening to the sounds of guards patrolling outside their building, Sarah began to formulate a plan that would either lead to freedom or result in consequences too terrible to contemplate. She knew that help, if it was coming, would have to find her soon, because her captors were already discussing moving her to a place from which rescue would be impossible. Meanwhile, at the Coalition Forward Operating Base, Captain Rodriguez was facing the most difficult briefing of his military career. Tom Bradley had survived his harrowing escape, but he arrived at the extraction point with devastating news. Sarah Mitchell and her companions had been captured, and Dr. Harrison and Maria Santos were missing and presumed killed or taken to a different location. The intelligence that Ahmed provided about Black Banner Brigade movements had already proved valuable in 3 successful airstrikes against militant supply convoys, but the cost of obtaining that information weighed heavily on everyone involved in the operation. Tom blamed himself for the decision to continue toward the extraction point rather than attempting a rescue, even though every military manual and security protocol supported his choice. Captain Rodriguez immediately initiated Protocol 7, the Coalition's standard response for captured personnel situations. This involved notifying higher command, coordinating with intelligence assets, and beginning the complex process of determining whether a rescue operation was feasible. The captain had been involved in 2 previous hostage situations during his deployment, and he knew that the chances of success decreased dramatically with each passing hour. The initial intelligence assessment was grim. The Black Banner Brigade operated from mountainous terrain that made conventional military approaches extremely difficult. Their strongholds were protected by natural barriers, extensive cave systems, and carefully positioned defensive positions that had been developed over several years. Satellite surveillance had identified at least 15 possible locations where hostages might be held, spread across an area of over 200 square kilometers. More challenging was the political dimension of any rescue attempt. The region where Sarah was believed to be held was technically outside the official coalition operational zone, meaning that any military action would require approval from multiple governments and could potentially escalate the conflict in ways that political leaders were reluctant to risk. Diplomatic channels were explored, but the Black Banner Brigade had never shown interest in negotiating prisoner exchanges or ransom payments. Lieutenant Colonel Marcus Webb, the commanding officer for special operations in the region, arrived at the forward operating base 3 days after Sarah's capture. Webb was a career soldier with extensive experience in hostage rescue operations, having served in Afghanistan, Somalia, and Iraq over nearly 2 decades of military service. His reputation was built on successful missions that others had considered impossible, but also on his unwillingness to authorize operations that would likely result in unnecessary casualties. Webb's first step was to assemble every piece of available intelligence about the Black Banner Brigade and their mountain strongholds. This included satellite imagery, intercepted communications, reports from local informants, and detailed interviews with Tom Bradley and Ahmed al-Rashid about their months working in the region. The picture that emerged was of a sophisticated organization with multiple layers of security and contingency plans for exactly this type of situation. The colonel also faced a ticking clock that added urgency to every decision. Intelligence sources suggested that the Black Banner Brigade typically moved high-value hostages to more secure locations within 2 weeks of capture. Understanding that the longer hostages remained in one place, the greater the likelihood of a successful rescue operation. This meant that any military action would need to be planned and executed within a very narrow window. Webb's team included some of the most experienced Special Forces operators in the region. Master Sergeant Jake Morrison was a combat veteran with 12 deployments and expertise in mountain warfare. Technical Sergeant Lisa Chen specialized in communications and electronic intelligence gathering. Staff Sergeant David Park was a medic with extensive training in trauma care under combat conditions. The team was rounded out by Sergeant First Class Tony Martinez, whose skills in languages and cultural liaison had proved invaluable in previous operations. The planning process began with careful analysis of each possible location where hostages might be held. Satellite surveillance was enhanced with drone reconnaissance flights that provided detailed imagery of militant compounds and movement patterns. Electronic intelligence assets were repositioned to intercept communications that might reveal Sarah's location or the militants' intentions regarding her fate. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. Ahmed al-Rashid, despite his own trauma from the escape, provided crucial information about a conversation he had overheard during their final night at the aid compound. A local man had mentioned that his cousin worked as a driver for militants in the mountains, transporting supplies between different camps. Ahmed had not considered this information significant at the time, but military intelligence was able to use it to identify and track several vehicles that regularly traveled between known Black Banner Brigade positions. After 5 days of surveillance, the intelligence team identified a compound that showed patterns consistent with holding high-value prisoners. The location featured increased guard rotations, restricted access routes, and communication activity that suggested the presence of senior leadership. Most significantly, thermal imaging from drone surveillance showed the presence of additional people in a specific building within the compound, including what appeared to be children. Lieutenant Colonel Webb made the decision to recommend a rescue operation, but he faced significant obstacles in getting approval from higher command. The target location was in extremely difficult terrain that would require helicopter insertion under conditions where enemy fire was almost certain. The intelligence was strong but not definitive, meaning that operators might risk their lives attempting to rescue hostages who were not actually at that location. The colonel also had to consider the broader strategic implications of the mission. A successful rescue would undoubtedly save Sarah's life and potentially provide valuable intelligence about Black Banner Brigade operations. However, a failed mission could result in multiple military casualties, the certain execution of any hostages, and potential escalation of the conflict that could endanger other coalition personnel throughout the region. After extensive consultation with intelligence analysts, military planners, and political advisors, Webb received conditional authorization for the rescue operation. The mission would proceed only if real-time intelligence could confirm Sarah's presence at the target location immediately before the operation began. This meant that the Special Forces team would need to infiltrate very close to the militant compound to conduct final reconnaissance before deciding whether to proceed with the assault. The plan that emerged was complex and dangerous, requiring precise coordination between multiple military units operating in challenging terrain under combat conditions. The Special Forces team would be inserted by helicopter at a landing zone several kilometers from the target, then approach on foot through mountainous terrain under cover of darkness. Electronic warfare assets would attempt to disrupt militant communications during the assault, while close air support would be positioned to provide covering fire if the team encountered heavy resistance during extraction. Master Sergeant Morrison spent hours studying topographical maps and satellite imagery, planning approach routes that would minimize the team's exposure while maintaining tactical flexibility. The compound was built into a hillside with natural barriers that limited approach options, but also created potential blind spots that could be exploited by properly trained operators moving under cover of darkness. As the team made final preparations for what everyone knew would be an extremely dangerous mission, Lieutenant Colonel Webb received one additional piece of intelligence that changed everything. Electronic intercepts had detected radio communications indicating that the Black Banner Brigade was indeed planning to move their high-value hostages within the next 48 hours. The rescue attempt would have to be launched immediately, or Sarah Mitchell would disappear into the mountain cave. systems where finding her would become virtually impossible. The colonel gave the final authorization, knowing that he was sending his best operators into a situation where success was far from guaranteed, but where failure would mean abandoning an American aid worker to almost certain death at the hands of militants who had never shown mercy to their prisoners. The Special Forces team inserted under cover of complete darkness, their helicopter approaching the landing zone with engines muffled and navigation lights extinguished. Master Sergeant Morrison led his team through terrain that challenged even their extensive mountain warfare training, navigating by compass and GPS while maintaining complete radio silence to avoid detection by militant listening posts. The approach to the target compound took 4 hours of careful movement through rocky terrain and dense vegetation. Technical Sergeant Chen carried specialized electronic equipment that allowed her to monitor militant communications and identify security patrol patterns. The intelligence proved invaluable, revealing that the Black Banner Brigade maintained a sophisticated network of sentries and early warning positions that could have detected a less carefully planned approach. 2 kilometers from the target, the team established an observation post that provided clear sight lines to the compound, while remaining concealed among the natural rock formations that dotted the hillside. Through high-powered optical equipment, they could observe guard rotations, identify weapon positions, and begin the delicate process of confirming whether their intelligence about hostage locations was accurate. The compound was more heavily fortified than satellite imagery had suggested. In addition to the obvious defensive positions, Morrison observed carefully camouflaged fighting positions that could bring devastating crossfire to bear on any assault force. The militants had clearly learned from previous coalition operations, implementing defensive improvements that would make any direct assault extremely costly. Staff Sergeant Park, monitoring the compound through thermal imaging equipment, identified heat signatures in the building where intelligence suggested hostages were being held. The patterns were consistent with several people confined in a relatively small space, including what appeared to be children based on their size and heat signatures. This information was crucial, but it still did not definitively confirm Sarah's presence or provide tactical intelligence about guard strength inside the building. The team faced a critical decision point. They could continue observing to gather more intelligence, but each hour of delay increased the risk that the hostages would be moved to an even more secure location. Alternatively, they could proceed with the assault based on current intelligence, accepting the risks inherent in incomplete information about enemy strength and hostage locations. Morrison made the tactical decision to proceed, but with a modification to the original plan. Instead of a simultaneous assault on multiple points, the team would focus on gaining entry to the suspected hostage building, while creating diversions that would draw militant attention away from the primary objective. This approach increased the chances of successfully extracting the hostages, while minimizing the team's exposure to the compound's heaviest defensive positions. The assault began at 3 a.m, when militant alertness would typically be at its lowest point. Chen initiated electronic jamming that disabled the compound's primary communication systems, preventing calls for reinforcement while creating confusion among the defenders. Simultaneously, Martinez positioned himself to provide sniper support, targeting key defensive positions and guard posts that could interfere with the main assault. Morrison and Park approached the hostage building, using a route that took advantage of blind spots identified during their observation. The building's construction presented both opportunities and challenges for a rescue operation. The stone walls provided excellent protection for the hostages once the team reached them, but the single entrance and barred windows created potential choke points that could trap the operators if the assault failed. Inside the compound, Sarah heard the first explosions and gunfire with a mixture of hope and terror. She had been expecting some form of militant retaliation or movement to a new location, but the sounds of combat suggested something else entirely. The distinctive crack of high-powered rifles and the controlled bursts of automatic weapons fire indicated professional military tactics rather than the chaotic fighting she had witnessed between different militant groups. Abu Rashad appeared at their door within minutes of the assault beginning, his face grim with the realization that his compound was under attack by forces far more sophisticated than local rivals or poorly equipped coalition units. He spoke rapidly in Arabic to several fighters, issuing orders that Sarah could not fully understand. but which clearly involved preparations for a fighting withdrawal or defensive stand. The militant leader's attention focused on Sarah with an intensity that made her blood run cold. She realized that he was calculating whether she represented an asset worth protecting or a liability that could compromise his escape if the compound was overrun. Fatima seemed to understand the danger as well, moving protectively in front of her children while keeping her eyes fixed on the armed men who controlled their fate. The sound of gunfire was growing closer, and Sarah could hear shouts in English mixed with the Arabic commands being issued by militant fighters. The realization that American forces were attempting a rescue filled her with hope, but also with the terrifying knowledge that rescue operations in hostile territory often resulted in casualties among the people being rescued. Morrison breached the hostage building's entrance using explosive charges that were precisely calculated to destroy the door while minimizing structural damage that could harm people inside. The blast was followed immediately by smoke grenades that created confusion, while protecting the assault team from defensive fire. Park followed closely behind, his medical equipment ready to treat wounded hostages while Morrison secured the immediate area. The interior of the building was exactly as intelligence had predicted, a central room with several smaller chambers branching off, designed for storage but adapted for holding prisoners. Sarah's voice calling out in English guided Morrison directly to their location, where he found not only the American aid worker but also a local woman and 4 children whose presence had not been anticipated in the mission planning. The tactical situation was complicated by the need to extract 6 people instead of 1, including children who were traumatized and might not be able to move quickly or follow complex instructions under combat conditions. Morrison made the immediate decision to call for additional extraction support while beginning preparations to move the hostages to a more defensible position within the compound. Sarah's relief at seeing American soldiers was overwhelming, but she quickly realized that the rescue was far from complete. The sounds of fighting throughout the compound indicated that the Special Forces team was significantly outnumbered, and Abu Rashad's earlier radio communications suggested that reinforcements from other Black Banner Brigade positions were already en route. Park began triaging the hostages for medical issues that could affect their ability to move quickly. Layla was still weak from her recent illness, and one of the older boys showed signs of injuries that had not been properly treated during their captivity. Most concerning was Fatima's psychological state. The woman was clearly in shock and might not be able to function effectively during the dangerous extraction that lay ahead. Chen's voice crackled through Morrison's radio with urgent intelligence updates. Electronic intercepts indicated that militant reinforcements were approaching the compound from 3 different directions, and the team's extraction helicopters were encountering heavier anti-aircraft fire than anticipated. The window for a successful extraction was closing rapidly, and the team would need to make critical decisions about risk and timing within the next few minutes. Morrison looked at Sarah, recognizing in her eyes the determination and courage that had allowed her to survive weeks in captivity while protecting a local family. He realized that their survival now depended not just on military training and superior firepower, but on the aid workers' knowledge of the compound, her relationship with her fellow captives, and her ability to make life or death decisions under the most extreme pressure imaginable. The rescue operation had succeeded in locating Sarah and the other hostages, but the most dangerous phase of the mission was just beginning. Morrison's tactical assessment was grim but not hopeless. The building where they had found Sarah provided excellent defensive positions, with thick stone walls that could withstand small arms fire, and limited access points that could be easily controlled. However, their position also represented a trap if militant reinforcements arrived before extraction helicopters could reach them. Sarah proved invaluable in those critical first minutes. Her weeks of observation had given her detailed knowledge of the compound's layout, guard positions, and the personalities of different militant leaders. She quickly briefed Morrison on Abu Rashad's likely tactical thinking, warning him that the Black Banner Brigade leader was both intelligent and ruthless enough to use extreme measures to prevent the hostages from being rescued. The most immediate challenge was moving 6 people, including traumatized children, through an active combat zone to a location where helicopters could safely extract them. The compound's defensive positions that had protected the militants now worked against the rescue operation, creating obstacles and choke points that would expose the group to devastating crossfire. Park worked quickly to prepare the hostages for movement, using simplified medical assessments to determine who could walk independently and who would need assistance. Layla was still weak but mobile, while her 8-year-old brother showed remarkable composure for his age. The 12-year-old, however, seemed almost paralyzed by the violence erupting around them, requiring special attention to prevent him from becoming a liability during the extraction. Fatima presented the greatest challenge. The weeks of captivity had taken a severe psychological toll, and the sudden violence of the rescue operation had pushed her into a state of near catatonic shock. She responded to direct commands, but showed little initiative or awareness of the danger they faced. Sarah realized that she would need to take primary responsibility for keeping the family together during whatever ordeal lay ahead. Chen's voice crackled through Morrison's radio with an update that changed everything. Primary extraction zone is compromised. Multiple RPG positions covering the LZ. Recommend alternate extraction point Alpha 7, but it's 2 clicks through hostile territory. Morrison studied his tactical map, calculating distances and timing while listening to the sounds of battle that indicated his teammates were facing increasing pressure from defending militants. Extraction point. Alpha 7 was a clearing on the far side of the compound, accessible only by crossing open ground that would expose them to fire from multiple positions. The sergeant made a decision that epitomized Special Forces thinking. Instead of choosing between 2 dangerous options, he would create a third alternative that minimized risk while maximizing their chances of success. Using Sarah's intelligence about the compound layout, he identified a route that would take them through a series of connected buildings, providing cover while moving toward an intermediate position where they could reassess their options. The plan required precise timing and coordination. Martinez would provide sniper support to suppress key defensive positions, while Chen maintained electronic jamming to prevent coordinated militant responses. Morrison and Park would move with the hostages, using smoke grenades and diversionary explosions to mask their movement through the compound. Sarah took charge of organizing the hostages for movement, speaking softly to Fatima in the few Arabic phrases she knew, while using gestures to communicate with the children. Her weeks of building trust with this family now proved crucial, as they looked to her for guidance and reassurance in a situation that would have terrified experienced adults. The movement began with a controlled explosion that destroyed a section of wall, creating a new exit point that militants would not expect. Morrison led the way, his night vision equipment allowing him to navigate through smoke and darkness while identifying threats before they could engage the vulnerable group behind him. The first 100 meters of movement went according to plan. They reached the adjacent building without taking fire, and the children showed remarkable discipline in following instructions despite their obvious fear. However, as they prepared to cross an open courtyard to reach the next building, the situation deteriorated rapidly. Abu Rashad had anticipated that any rescue force would attempt to reach the compound's perimeter, and he had positioned fighters to cover the most likely escape routes. As Morrison's group emerged from their temporary shelter, they came under intense fire from multiple directions, forcing them to take cover behind a damaged vehicle in the center of the courtyard. The tactical situation was desperate. They were pinned down in an exposed position, with limited ammunition and no immediate support available. Worse, the sound of approaching vehicles indicated that militant reinforcements were arriving faster than anticipated, potentially surrounding the compound before the rescue team could reach safety. Sarah found herself making split-second decisions that would determine whether everyone lived or died. She had noticed during her captivity that one of the compound's buildings contained a diesel generator that powered the communication equipment. If that generator could be destroyed, it would create both a distraction and eliminate the militants' ability to coordinate with their reinforcements. Morrison listened to Sarah's suggestion with the respect of a professional soldier who recognized valuable intelligence regardless of its source. The generator was only 50 meters away, but reaching it would require crossing open ground under fire. More importantly, destroying it would require someone to remain behind to set charges, while the others continued toward the extraction point. The sergeant was preparing to volunteer for what was essentially a suicide mission when Sarah made a decision that reflected the courage and commitment that had brought her to this dangerous part of the world in the first place. She had spent months building relationships with people like Fatima's family, and she was not going to abandon them now when they needed her protection most. "I know where the generator controls are," she told Morrison quietly. "Give me 30 seconds to reach that building, then move the others toward the extraction point. I'll catch up after I shut down their power." Morrison started to protest, but Sarah was already moving, using her knowledge of the compound's layout to approach the generator building from an angle that provided maximum cover. Her weeks of careful observation were about to be put to the ultimate test, as she attempted to single-handedly create the diversion that would save not only her own life, but the lives of the family she had sworn to protect. Behind her, Morrison prepared Fatima and her children for the most dangerous sprint of their lives, knowing that the next few minutes would determine whether this rescue operation became a success story or a tragedy that would haunt everyone involved for the rest of their lives. Sarah's sprint to the generator building was the longest 30 seconds of her life. Bullets kicked up dirt around her feet as she zigzagged between obstacles, using every technique she had learned during her security training months earlier. The knowledge that Fatima's children were depending on her success gave her strength she didn't know she possessed, pushing her forward even as fear threatened to paralyze her legs. She reached the generator building just as Morrison began moving the hostages toward their next position. The diesel engine that powered the compound's communications was housed in a concrete shed that provided protection from small arms fire. But Sarah knew that militants would soon realize what she was attempting and concentrate their efforts on stopping her. The control panel was more complex than she had anticipated. With multiple switches and gauges labeled in Arabic script, she could not read. However, her months of working with local communities had taught her to observe and adapt quickly. She began systematically throwing switches and disconnecting cables, hoping that her actions would disable not just the generator, but also the electrical systems that supported the militants' defensive coordination. The results exceeded her expectations. As the generator shut down, the compound was plunged into darkness except for the muzzle flashes of weapons fire. More importantly, the communication jamming equipment that Chen had been struggling to overcome suddenly went silent, allowing the Special Forces team to re-establish contact with their support elements for the first time since the assault began. Morrison's voice crackled through the radio. "Generator down. Excellent work. Moving to Checkpoint Bravo with the package. Need immediate extraction support at Alpha 7. The relief in his voice was audible, even through the static and background noise of continuing combat. Sarah began her own movement toward the extraction point, but the route that had brought her safely to the generator building was now compromised by militants who had repositioned to counter her actions. She found herself trapped in the concrete shed as automatic weapons fire chewed up the doorframe, preventing her from rejoining the main group. From her position, she could see Morrison's team moving through the compound with Fatima and her children. The darkness created by the generator shutdown was working in their favor, as the Special Forces operators' night vision equipment gave them a significant advantage over militants who were now effectively blind. However, Sarah realized that her own situation was becoming increasingly desperate. Abu Rashad's voice could be heard shouting commands in Arabic, and Sarah understood enough to know that he was organizing a coordinated assault on her position. The militant leader had correctly identified that the American aid worker represented both a valuable prize and a dangerous threat to his organization's reputation. He could not afford to let her escape after she had successfully disrupted his compound's defenses. Technical Sergeant Chen had been monitoring militant communications throughout the operation, and her next radio transmission provided both hope and urgency. Extraction birds inbound ETA 4 minutes. Heavy ground fire reported at Alpha 7. Recommend immediate movement to LZ. Morrison faced an agonizing decision. His primary mission was to extract all hostages, but Sarah's position was now separated from the main group by hostile territory that would be extremely dangerous to cross. Military doctrine was clear. He could not risk the lives of 5 people. He had already rescued in an attempt to save one person who had voluntarily separated from the group. Sarah understood the tactical situation as clearly as any trained soldier. Through her radio, which Park had given her before their movement began, she could hear the team's communications and knew that her rescue was becoming increasingly unlikely. However, she also knew that Morrison would continue attempting to reach her unless she explicitly released him from that obligation. "Bravo, team. This is Sarah," she transmitted, her voice steady despite the gunfire that was growing increasingly accurate. "I can see your position from here. Take the family to the LZ. Do not attempt extraction of my position. Repeat, do not compromise the main mission for one person." Morrison's response revealed the character that had made him one of the military's most respected special operations leaders. "Negative. Sarah, no one gets left behind. We're coming to get you." But Sarah had spent months learning to make difficult decisions under pressure, and she understood that leadership sometimes meant accepting personal sacrifice for the greater good. She also had one advantage that the Special Forces team did not. Her weeks of captivity had given her detailed knowledge of the compound's cave systems and hidden passages that even the militants might not fully understand. Instead of waiting for rescue that might never come, Sarah decided to attempt her own escape using routes she had observed during her captivity. The generator building connected to a drainage system that led to the mountainside beyond the compound's perimeter. It would be dangerous and difficult, but it offered the possibility of reaching safety without endangering the family she had fought so hard to protect. As she prepared to enter the drainage tunnel, Sarah heard the distinctive sound of approaching helicopters. The extraction birds were arriving precisely on schedule, but the amount of ground fire they were receiving suggested that the landing zone was heavily contested. Every minute of delay increased the risk that the helicopters would be forced to withdraw without completing the extraction. Morrison's team reached the LZ just as the first helicopter touched down. The pilot kept his engines running and his aircraft in a hover, ready to lift off immediately if the tactical situation deteriorated further. Fatima and her children were loaded aboard with practiced efficiency, but Morrison refused to board until Sarah's situation was resolved. "Sarah, what's your status?" he transmitted, watching tracer fire streak across the valley as militants attempted to bring down the extraction helicopters. Sarah's voice came back calm and determined. "I'm mobile and moving to alternate extraction point Charlie. Give me 10 minutes to reach high ground, then come back for me." Extraction point Charlie was a rocky outcropping nearly a kilometer from the compound, accessible only by climbing treacherous mountain terrain in complete darkness. Morrison realized that Sarah was attempting something that even experienced mountain troops would find challenging. But he also understood that she might be their only hope of completing the mission without casualties. The helicopter lifted off with Morrison, Park, and the rescued family aboard, while Chen and Martinez remained on the ground to provide support for Sarah's escape attempt. As they climbed into the night sky, Morrison could see muzzle flashes throughout the compound as militants searched for the American aid worker who had managed to disrupt their entire defensive plan. Sarah's journey through the drainage system and up the mountainside tested every skill she had developed during her months in the region. She navigated by memory and instinct, using landmarks visible in the starlight to guide her toward the extraction point. Behind her, the sounds of searching militants grew fainter as she climbed higher into terrain that few people knew well enough to follow in darkness. When she finally reached extraction point Charlie, Sarah was exhausted, injured from multiple falls during her climb, but alive and free. The helicopter that came to collect her carried not just a rescued hostage, but a woman whose courage under the most extreme circumstances had saved the lives of an entire family and demonstrated the best qualities of the humanitarian spirit that had brought her to this dangerous region in the first place. As they flew toward safety, Sarah looked down at the compound where she had spent weeks as a prisoner, now burning in several places as a result of the night's combat. She thought about Abu, Rashad, and wondered whether their conversations about education and philosophy might have planted seeds that could someday grow into something better than violence and hatred. Most importantly, she held Layla's small hand as the child slept peacefully for the first time in weeks, surrounded by people who had risked everything to ensure that she and her family could return to safety, and the possibility of rebuilding their lives in freedom.